Welcome, everybody. So pleased to introduce Shulie Mishkin as today's speaker. I'm sorry, I'm looking at all the faces. It's wonderful to see both familiar faces and many new ones as well. So welcome, everybody, to the next in our Israeli speaker series. I'm not going to give you the whole bio for Shulie Mishkin. That will be that's going into the chat. But I will say that I had an email from somebody during the week who said, "Oh, we had her as a tour guide when we went to Israel. She's wonderful." So I'm sure we're all in for a treat this morning. And coming from very cold Boston, we can all warm up with thoughts of, I don't know what the weather's like in Israel today, but we can all warm up with the thoughts that at least we can imagine that it's warm and pleasant in Israel. So with no further ado, please, Shulie Mishkin.
Okay, thank you, Deborah. Hi, everybody. We were just chatting before, and I was saying how much I like Boston. I'm from New York, and Boston people are much nicer. So we like you better. So what we're going to do today, mostly you're not going to be looking at me. I'm not very interesting to look at. I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to do that actually starting right now. And we are going to discuss a very vast and complex topic. With many issues and many difficulties, but we're going to try to illuminate a little what life was like in the time of the Mishnah, in the time of the Gemara. I'll just say before I get started, I am so happy to answer any questions, but I'm going to save them all for the end. So if you're worried you're going to forget your question, put it in the chat and I will look at it and hopefully I will remember what it was you were asking your question about, or you can write it down and just ask it at the end. So we want to understand, especially anybody who's ever learned today, so many more of us are learning Daf Yomi, or even if you just learned a story from the Gemara, Mishnah, you want to understand the realities. What was life like? And that illuminates so much more and makes the story so much clearer. So that's what we're going to try to do a little bit. Largely using archaeology and what archaeology has shown us about the text, as well as modern scholarship. And I started out with something very basic, okay? This coin that you can see here, this is what is called a pruta, or what we would call a penny, okay? It is the lowest value of money. We know a lot about money. The Gemara talks a lot about money. We know about the amount of money that a woman gets in her marriage contract. We know about money in all different kinds of situations. We hear about different kinds of coins, an isar, a maneh, a dinar, a zuz, right? Pesach coming up soon. Chad Gadya, that was bought for the 2 zuzeh, right? The trey zuzeh. So we know about different kinds of coins, but actually seeing these coins makes it so much more real. And a pruta is very important. First of all, we find many prutot in archaeology. Why? Because they're the coin of the lowest value. And if you dropped a penny on the street, how likely are you going to be to retrace your steps or even to bend down and pick it up? You're not necessarily going to bother. And in those days, they didn't always bother either. And that's why we find prutot much more than we find much more valuable coins, which you will bother to go and get. Okay. And a pruta is important to us in Jewish law because we know that anything that is worth less than a pruta, right, is not shaveh pruta. It's as if it's nothing, right? It's as if it's nothing. Yeah, pruta, as little as it is, that's something that's considered valuable. You can make a purchase with it. But less than that, that's as if it's nothing. So that was what I brought to start us off with, a very common, but to see it is so much more real. So we're going to try to get ourselves a sense of where we are, when we are. Okay, mostly we are going to be talking about the land of Israel, even though obviously when we get to the Gemara, right, we have the Jerusalem Talmud, we have the Babylonian Talmud, and we're going to see those are two different realities. But let's understand what we're talking about when we talk about the land of Israel. Okay, so let's just take a look at this nice colorful map. And I'm going to make it even more colorful by scribbling on it a little bit. Okay, we have our core Jewish area, which is Judea. right? And we are really, of course, talking about the Second Temple and later time period. We're going to see a timeline in a little bit. Okay, so this is the land that the Jews return to, Shivat Zion, when they return after the Babylonian exile. This is the core where they begin, of course, Jerusalem and the areas around. Eventually, a few hundred years later, with the story of Hanukkah, the Hasmoneans, we expand to the area of the Galilee. So these are our two important Jewish areas that have different characters, by the way, right? The Gemara talks about the people of Judea and the people of the Galilee, and they're not necessarily the same, right? People of Judea are much more directly connected to the temple. They know much more about the temple. They keep Hebrew. Hebrew is their language, as opposed to in the Galilee, where we find much more Aramaic and Greek. Okay, people of Judea are much more into all different kinds of sectarian groups. The people of the Galilee, we don't hear that much about them. On the other hand, the people of the Galilee seem to be somewhat more modest, more generous. Right? These are obviously stereotypes, but they're backed up by certain things we hear about in the Gemara. Right? So we have Judea, and we have the Galilee, and then we have other areas. Right? We have the area of the coast. Okay, coast, which in biblical times was the area of the Philistines, the Phoenicians. In Second Temple and later times, this is also not a particularly Jewish area. This is where you have Greek population, still the Phoenician population. You have Greek cities, pagan cities, right? Polises, right? Places like Caesarea. It doesn't mean Jews don't live there, but Jews are not the majority and they don't set the culture. Okay, so that's a group that we have on the coast, which is a little bit of a different reality. We have in the south, we have this area called Idumea, right? From Edom, the Edomites, who at the end of the first temple period, after the destruction of the temple, they come into this area. Okay, so that's another foreign entity in the land of Israel. Nabateans, Edomites, these nomads. And then we have this strange group here, right? We have this area of Samaria, which today you'd say, oh, it's Arab, it's Jewish, but it's got a lot of historical biblical sites. But in Second Temple and later times, this is not a Jewish site per se. This is an area that's controlled by the Samaritans, the Shomronim. They see themselves as Jews. The other Jews don't see them as Jews. So there's frequently a lot of animosity between the two groups. So between the Jewish strongholds of the Galilee and Judea, you have Samaria, not a particularly friendly place. Now that we've scribbled all over this map, let's move on just to understand a little bit of the area outside the land of Israel, because of course the diaspora is important to us also. By the time we get to Second Temple times, we have a vibrant Jewish diaspora. Starts out, of course, in Babylonia, where the Jews are exiled to, as well as in Egypt, right? So let's just understand where we are, right? Here's our Babylonia, between the Tigris and the Euphrates. Very vibrant Jewish community that goes back to the end of First Temple times. We have a Jewish community in Egypt, primarily in Alexandria. We have Jewish community over here in what's called Asia Minor, right? This area up here. And we even have Jews that have made it all the way to Rome, to Greece, right? So we have Jews from lots of different places, lots of different cultures. It's a fascinating story in and of itself, how in the Second Temple times, we change from a nation that everybody is in one place, speaking one language, having one culture, to a nation that is very spread out and that maintains something that the Jewish historian Shia Cohen talks about. He talks about unity within diversity. On the one hand, a Jew from Babylonia will speak a different language than a Jew from Rome. He'll dress differently. He'll eat differently. Okay, he might have different customs. On the other hand, go from one place to the other, and you know that you can go into the synagogue on Friday night and be invited home for a Shabbat meal, and many things will be familiar to you. So that's one of the powerful things that happens in Second Temple times, is that the Jews spread out and yet retain their identity as one nation. So that's important to understand. But there are, of course, many differences in the languages that they speak, in the culture that they have. Perhaps the most important difference for us, here I'll erase for a second, okay, is the difference between the land of Israel and Babylonia, because these are the centers, right? These are the centers not so much in the time of the Mishnah, it's only beginning, but by the time of the Gemara, Babylonia is a very, very important center of Jewish learning that ultimately surpasses the land of Israel. And these are two very different worlds, because Babylonia is under the authority of an empire called the Parthians, and the land of Israel is under the authority, of course, of the Roman Empire, right? We're on the eastern border of the Roman Empire. And that means that our language is different and our culture is different and our legal system is different. Not to mention, besides all of those things, the natural differences, climate, topography, everything else. So when the Gemara in the Babylonian Talmud talks about the land of Israel, we have to take it with a grain of salt unless it's coming from a scholar coming from the land of Israel. We can't always generalize. We can't always assume that the Bavli is speaking about Judea. Okay, so we have a lot of things we cannot generalize. We're going to try to step between those minefields in any case. Okay, a little quick timeline here, just have a sense of when we're talking about. Okay, so from the Great Revolt to the Mishnah, Great Revolt meaning, of course, the all these dates are a common era, right? Meaning the battle against the Romans that culminates with the destruction of the temple. So we have that from the year 66 to 70. The temple is destroyed, Masada falls, but this is with the temple's destruction. This is also when we get rid of sectarianism and we get a real beginning to the power, the authority of the rabbis. And the switching from Beit Mikdash, right, from temple to Beit Midrash, study hall, right? Not that we don't continue to pray for the temple, but that the study hall and the rabbis replace the temple and the Kohanim and the priests in many ways. And we have the center in Yavne and Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, who works very hard to, on the one hand, remember the temple, and on the other hand, to continue without it. Okay. Then we have two revolts, one in the diaspora, the Trajan Revolt, has less effect in the land of Israel. We also don't know that much about it. And then something that creates a seismic change in the land of Israel, the Bar Kokhba revolt, right? In the early 2nd century of the Common Era, Bar Kokhba revolt, which essentially destroys Jewish life in Judea. The Romans forbid Jews from coming to Jerusalem, and Jewish life moves to the north. And that's really a huge change. If before that, even after the temple is destroyed, Jewish life is still in the areas not far from Jerusalem, Yavne, Lod, Bnei Brak. After the Bar Kokhba revolt, we move up north, right? We move to the Galilee. The Sanhedrin moves, as we see here. Usha, Shfar'am, Beit Sharim, Tzipori, Tiberias, all of these are in the Galilee. And Judea and Jerusalem especially becomes a place that you dream about and a place that you imagine, but not a place that you go to. Okay? With the troubles and the dispersion of the rabbis, finally in the year 200, Rabbi Judah the Prince, the last generation of the Tanaim, of the rabbis of the Mishnah, makes a very dramatic decision to write down the oral law, right? To take all these oral compilations of Mishnayot and Braitot and Toseftot and to create the Mishnah. And that's the end of the time period of the Mishnah. After that, we talk about the Gemara. So we want to understand what's going on in this time period. So we have a few basic problems. Okay? One of the problems is that the Mishnah and the Gemara is not a history in any way, right? Occasionally, or more than occasionally, we get historical stories and they're fascinating and they're great, but there is no linear history. We don't know how you get from point A to point B. The Mishnah rarely talks about history at all or stories at all, and when it does, it's obviously going to be something very important. And even the Gemara, it's derech agav, it's by the way, I'm going to tell you the story because that's not the main point of my composition. So we're missing a lot of knowledge about history. We're also missing, and that's what this picture is about, common knowledge. And that's why I said, which one is a kitchen, right? So when we read about cooking or baking in the Mishnah, right? Or getting your food hot for Shabbat, even the most historically minded of us, I think, imagines our kitchens with our ranges, with our hot plates, with our timers, because it's very hard to put yourself into a different historical reality. Okay, so there are many assumptions that the Mishnah assumes because it's being written at the time that these things are happening. So among them is, what does the kitchen look like? It looks a lot more like the picture on the right than the picture on the left. We're going to get into the kitchen in a minute. But not only that, What was a common diet? What did people eat? What are these strange foods that we don't eat anymore? What was their medicine? What did their furniture look like? Hey, how many people lived in a house, right? That's a pretty basic question that we really can't even answer today. You could ask that question, you could give a basic answer. We don't even have such an answer to that question. And houses expanded and contracted according to the seasons. So we have many questions that we need to answer. And the question is, where do these answers come from? So archaeology is going to help us. How does archaeology help us? So I brought you a few examples, right? Case study number one, the Bar Kokhba revolt, right? The Bar Kokhba revolt, unlike the Great Revolt, has no Jewish historian that writes about it. The Great Revolt, we are very fortunate. We don't always like everything he has to say, but we are very fortunate to have the historian Josephus, Yosef ben Matityahu, who tells us a linear story. This is what happened first, this is what happened next. For the Bar Kokhba revolt, we don't have that. We have a little piece here, a little piece there, a little in the Gemara, a little in the Romans, hints about it, but archaeology has now filled in so much. So one example of this, right, is we have two different directions that we could go if we hear about cave complexes in the Bar Kokhba revolt. Okay? The Roman historian Dio Cassius tells us like this. To be sure, this is the top source here, they did not dare try conclusions with the Romans in the open field, right? The Roman army is much more vast than the Jewish army, but they occupied the advantageous positions in the country, strengthened them with mines and walls in order that they might have places of refuge whenever they should be hard pressed and might meet together unobserved underground. And they pierced these subterranean passages from above at intervals to let in air and light. So Dio Cassius tells us caves. There are cave systems, there are hideout systems, because otherwise there's no way that the Jews could possibly overcome the Romans. Now, the Gemara, the Jewish sources also reflect, they talk about, there are stories, a little bit of stories here and there about caves, there are halachot, right? And it seems that cave complexes were something that were around. So here's one example, and it's a very extreme example, but it's a very powerful example. Gemara in Ketubot says, Rabbi Idi bar Avin said, Rav Yitzchak bar Ashyan said, if there's a single hideaway in the city, right, a machboah is the Hebrew word, a cave that you could go hide out in, where the women could hide from the soldiers, it saves all the women married to priests. We have a law, it's a difficult law, which says that if a woman is married to a Kohen and she is raped, she cannot return to her husband. It's a very terrible law. And the rabbis are trying to figure out a way to help those women. And they say, you know what? If there's one cave in the city that it's possible, theoretically, that women could go and hide there when the soldiers come rampaging through the town, then we assume that all the women hid there, right? That gives us this little halachic legal statement, opens up a whole world. There are the Roman soldiers coming through would rape the women. There are hideout caves in the town. They would prepare for them. All of these are things that are just kind of implied in the text. And lo and behold, in the past 50 years, when we've been excavating, suddenly we are finding cave complex after cave complex throughout Judea, some in the Galilee as well, okay, literally hundreds of them, okay, showing us where the revolt took place, showing us that this is part of the reality of the war, was these hideout caves, and showing us that this law was a very practical law and not at all a theoretical law, okay. The other thing we don't know about the Bar Kokhba revolt, it's named after a guy named Bar Kokhba, but we know almost nothing about him, right? Rabbi Akiva does a midrash, right, where he says, Darach Kochav mi Yaakov, there's a star that shines forth from Jacob. This is Bar Koziba, right? This is the son of Koziba, who really should be called Bar Kokhba. Who is this person? We don't know very much. The rabbis don't like him. Whatever we know about them is very derogatory. But then again, 50 years ago, amazing archaeological mission to caves in the Judean desert, right, led by Yigael Yadin. And they found this cave, and you can see this incredibly remote cave. They needed the army's assistance to go and explore it. And in this cave, they found all sorts of artifacts. We're going to come back to some of them a little bit later. Among them, right, the most powerful, I think, are these keys. Okay, people took their house keys when they went to hide out, when they were running away from the Romans during the revolt. They took their keys and they never went home again because we found the keys in the cave. But they also found parchment. They found letters, and the letters were signed by someone named Shimon Nisi Israel, Shimon, the president of Israel. This is Bar Kokhba. Okay? We have letters from Bar Kokhba. So we are getting a glimpse into the story, and we're putting the pieces of the story together. What we don't have from the literature, we're finding in the archaeology. Case study number 2. What is Jewish art? Okay, one of the great professors, scholars of the synagogue, Professor Yisrael Levine, says if 100 years ago you could say Jewish art is XYZ and it is not ABC, you cannot say that anymore, because we keep finding more and more and more things that are showing us that Jewish art is all over the place, right? Even in the literature, right? The rabbis have a very strong range of opinions. You shouldn't have any images. You can have certain images. You can't have the images of the sun or the moon. You can't have any 3D images, right? We're finding all those things. We're finding all those things. So I brought you 2 examples here. Okay? One is this zodiac from a synagogue in Hamat, Tveria. We have a few synagogues with zodiac images. And this one has this incredible, in the middle, right? This guy who looks like he's in the Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade, right? He's waving at everybody. This is Helios, the sun god, in the middle of the zodiac. This is in a synagogue in Hamat Tveria. We know it's a synagogue. It's very clear from the other parts of the mosaic that it's a synagogue. Did the rabbis condone this? Did the people just do it? We don't know, right? We don't know, but we have found this and others like it. And the other picture, which is a little bit harder to see, a lot harder to see, I apologize. Okay, this is a synagogue in Chorazim, north of the Kinneret, and one of the stone pillars has a depiction on it. I don't know if everybody can see it. Can you see her fabulous hair? This is Medusa. Okay, it has a picture of Medusa with her wild hair, okay, in the synagogue. And again, this is undoubtedly a synagogue. So what is Jewish art? Jewish art is what Jews made, right? And what they put into their institutions. And the stories that we see in the synagogues as well. We thought, oh, it's all certain typological stories. Oh, it's all about the binding of Isaac, or maybe the stories, pictures of the Mikdash. No, we're finding more, especially in the Galilee, pictures of Samson, stories that we never thought we would find before. So these are from 2 different synagogues near the Kinneret, Wadi Hammam and Chukok. Here's Samson with the gates of Gaza on his shoulders, or on his head, really. And here's Samson fighting all the Philistines. We found pictures of the Tower of Babel. We found pictures of the splitting of the Red Sea, right? Amazing, amazing things. So that's a case study number 2 that archaeology can help us with. And one last case study before we get down to the nitty gritty, everyday objects. And this is perhaps the most fascinating, especially for people who learn on a regular basis, because we're always talking about these everyday objects, and suddenly to find them is an amazing thing, right? So here's example number 1. Take a look at the picture on the right. This is obviously a coin, but it's a very particular kind of coin. Okay, you can see this proud eagle here. This is a Tyrian silver shekel, or what the rabbis call a shekel tsori. Okay, when you come to the temple, or even if you don't come to the temple, you send with somebody who's going to the temple every year. Every household has to give a half shekel tax, machatzit shekel. Right, Rosh Chodesh Adar is coming up soon. That's when we start to talk about the half shekel, right? You have to give it, but the rabbis say you can't just give it from any coins. You can't just give it from any silver. There were good mints and there were bad mints. There were mints that watered down their silver. I know that's not the right term, but you know what I mean, okay? And the mints that were good were the mints in Tyre, okay? Tyre in Lebanon of today. Shekel tsori, that's what you need to give. And this is a shekel tsori. And we found them in various places around the land of Israel, including in Jerusalem, where they were undoubtedly being brought to give as your tax to the temple. Okay, a much more humble object, but a very important object. Okay, the metal is obviously new, but the stone is old. Okay, this is called a ma'agela. Okay, or a roller. Why do you need such a roller? It's not for paint. It's made out of stone. It's very heavy. Okay, but in the old days, what did you do for your roof? For most people, they had rafters, they had thatch, and then they would put on plaster. And every winter, you put on, or fall, you put on new plaster, and you use this ma'agela, okay, to straighten out the plaster and to make your roof nice and watertight for the winter. Now, we know about a character in Chazal, very significant character, whose name is Choni hama'agel. And many of you will say, well, Choni hama'agel, right? He's the circle drawer. He draws a circle and he says to God, I'm not stepping out of this circle until you make the rain come down. That's true. That is the story. But I think it's a play on the fact that he's also a ma'agel, meaning this is his job. He takes the ma'agelah, he goes from town to town, and he straightens out the plaster on top of the roof. Does it take away from the miracle? No, it adds to the story. It makes it deeper and stronger. So who are our guides in this quest to understand the stories, the life, everything else? So these are a few of them. One of the great early guides, this is clearly not 1992. Sorry, I wrote that wrong. I think it's 1922. I have to go back and check it. Sorry. Professor Yehuda Felix. Professor Yehuda Felix, along with other scholars, wrote definitive works on plants and animals in the Bible and in the Mishnah, right? Years and years and years of living detached from the land of Israel, living in the diaspora, and we didn't always know what the plants were, right? What was maror? What is a nesher? What is a tzvi? And Felix comes back to the land of Israel and starts to explore that and to understand it. Okay? Another more contemporary example, amazing book if you're into this stuff. Okay? The Safrai family, the father Shmuel and the children Ze'ev and Chana, writing a series called Mishnat Eretz Yisrael, the Mishnah of the land of Israel, where they take the Mishnayot and they add in commentary connected to what we can find in archaeology, in nature, and in the reality of the land of Israel. Other guides, okay, Noga HaReuveni and Neo Kedumim. I'm sure there are some people here who have been to Neo Kedumim. It's a beautiful nature park not far from Modi'in. Noga HaReuveni's parents, Ephraim and Chana HaReuveni, were botanists. They founded the botany department in Hebrew University. And they had a dream to create a park that would be filled with the plants and the animals of Tanakh and of the Mishnah. They didn't do it, but their son Noga did it. And this is part of the very famous exhibit that they have there every Sukkot, which is the different sukkahs that are described in the Mishnah in Sukkah. And this is a sukkah al-gabei gamal, as you can see, a sukkah on top of a camel. And of course, archaeologists, right here you have Yigael Yadin, who we're going to talk about when we talk more about Bar Kokhba, but so many other archaeologists using archaeology as well as other skills. For example, Ehud Netzer, who did a ton of research on Herod and Herod structures in Masada and Herodian and Jericho. He starts out life as an architect, and he uses that architectural knowledge to explicate what's going on in the archaeology. Izhar Hirschfeld, who would go around to old Arab villages and interview the Arabs about a traditional style of life. And this is what I mentioned before. We don't know how many people live in the house. He would come to a house and he would say, how many people live here? And they would say to him, are you talking about in the, in the planting season? Are you talking about in the gathering season? Different time periods you would have in the winter, in the summer, houses could expand and contract. So archaeologists, scholars, finding out from the local Arabs and applying it to our times. So we're going to look at a few different places. All right, we're going to start out with the house, which is the best place to start, right? We want to be at home. This is a drawing of an actual house that was built, modern built, but meant to look like the old days in Katzrin. If you've ever gone up north to the Golan, in Katzrin, there's a place called the Talmudic Village where they found actually ancient houses and ancient synagogue. Amazing. But what they did is they built also a model house so that you could really understand what we are talking about. And let's understand the components of this house. This is a house in the village. This is not necessarily a particularly wealthy person. This is a typical person, right? Living in a small village in the Golan. What are the components of their house, right? So most of your cooking, we're going to talk about kitchens. Most of what you do is outside or in the courtyard. That's your kitchen, unless it's rainy or cold or nighttime. And that's why you have a small indoor kitchen here. You have a storage area, okay? But your main living space in your house is this, what we would call today the multi-purpose room, okay? This is where you eat, this is where you prepare your food, this is where you hang out, and this is where most of the people in the household sleep at night, okay? If you're a fancier person, this is a triclinium, a living room, right? But for most people, this is just the trucklin, as the Mishnah talks about it, but this is just the main room. If you have a little more money, you have a second floor, right, where you have a room that has a little privacy, an aliyah, room for the parents, okay? You also have the roof. Roof is also very important. You use the roof for all sorts of things, for drying your fruit, for getting even more privacy, right? Going away from everybody, getting out of the middle of the household, hey, sitting and studying, sleeping up here on hot nights, right? So these are different parts of the house. And of course, the courtyard, the chatzer, right? Which most of the time, and up to relatively recently, even in Jerusalem, this was where people spent their day, right? Because you don't have so much space in the house. And you also don't have a lot of light. Realize that obviously there are walls here. This is a cutaway. They didn't have transparent glass, and you didn't want to have huge windows that didn't have any glass in them, because that lets in the elements and that lets in thieves. So you only have small little windows high up. So you don't have a lot of light. You don't have a lot of air. You're going to spend most of your time, weather permitting, in the courtyard, but you do have these inner rooms. So we're going to take a look at some of these rooms and what you have inside. Okay. Here's our aliyah. Okay. This is, again, these are pictures from the house in Katzrin. So here's our aliyah. We might know about the very famous aliyah we hear about in Lud, okay, where the rabbis met in an aliyah called the aliyah of Beit Nitza, of the house of Nitza in Lud. And that's where they come up with the decision that there are 3 things that you have to die rather than do them, right? Idolatry and murder and forbidden sexual relations. That happens in an aliyah. And here we have an aliyah, okay? We also have a story about it, and we have a few stories, but here's a good one, right? From Derech Eretz Rabbah. Once a man came to Rabbi Joshua's house. He fed him and gave him the attic room, the aliyah, to sleep in, removing the ladder afterwards. In the middle of the night, the guest took the dishes, put them in his cloak, but when he tried to go down, he fell from the attic and broke his neck. Now, the continuation of the story is the guest comes and he says, well, what kind of person are you that you took away the ladder? He says, what kind of person are you that you're trying to steal all my stuff, right? And that's Rabbi Joshua, Rabbi Yoshua, who had this approach of kabdehu v'chashdehu, right? You should treat everybody with great respect, give them a place in your house, feed them, but don't be so easy to trust people, right? So that's our upper bedroom. That's our aliyah. And our courtyard, right? Courtyard. If you learned any Mishnah in Nezikin, right? So much of Nezikin is about the courtyard, right? Who owns what in the courtyard? What is communally owned? What are you allowed to do in the courtyard? And what you basically have to realize, this is a very modern picture, right? Not modern, but from the 19th century. This is a courtyard of an old Jerusalem neighborhood called Beit David. It's right near the Ticho house in Jerusalem. This is a neighborhood from the 1870s, when the neighborhoods were still built like this, that you had small apartments around a central courtyard, and so much took place in the courtyard: cooking, laundry, socializing, right? And the courtyard is shared by everybody. So you have 2 conflicting issues going on in the courtyard. You need privacy, right? Everybody wants some privacy, but you're also all using it together, and it's communal property. And so many laws are connected to these issues of how you balance between those 2 things. So I just brought you 2 different ones, okay? A man may protest about the courtyard and say to him, I cannot sleep because of the noise that go in of those that go in and go out. One who makes utensils should go outside and sell them in the market. But none may protest and say to him, I cannot sleep because of the noise of the hammer or the noise of the millstones or the noise of the children, right? So there are limits. You can say to someone, you can't make a store here in the courtyard. There's too much going on. You can't make a tavern in the courtyard. You can't make something that people are coming and going all the time. It disturbs the others. But you can't say to someone, if you make certain things for your livelihood, right, you can't make them in the courtyard, because where's he going to make them? So you cannot say, I can't sleep because you're grinding flour. I can't sleep because you're building things. I can't sleep because of the children. Who are the children? Not the children of the families, but I want to have a little cheder. I want to have a little school in the courtyard. I want students to come. Nobody can say to you, you're not allowed to do that, right? So you have this very tenuous balance between what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. But the Mishnah goes on and says you can't do things that are going to be environmentally disturbing, right? You cannot have a tannery. You cannot have a workshop that creates a lot of waste. You cannot have something that makes incredible amounts of noise, right? So you have certain things that you're allowed, certain things you're not allowed, and you're always walking this fine line, right? But in general, you can do what you can stop people from doing certain things. Rabbi Yochanan says, here, take a look at the Gemara, the second paragraph. Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Bana, joint owners of a courtyard can stop one another from using the courtyard for any purpose. This kind of contradicts what we said in the Mishnah, except that of washing clothes, since it is not fitting that the daughters of Israel should expose themselves to the public gaze while washing clothes. You can't say, no, you have to go down to the river to wash your clothes, because that's immodest. So you have to allow that in the courtyard, and certain other things have to be allowed in the courtyard as well. So the courtyard is this shared space that's a complicated shared space. Now, I asked you guys before, what does the kitchen look like, right? There really is no kitchen, okay? They didn't have kitchens. They didn't have surfaces they worked on unless you were very, very wealthy, okay? Basically, everything is happening in the courtyard. Chazal do not have a word for kitchen, right? Today we have a modern word, mitbach, but they didn't have such a word because there really wasn't such an idea. You worked in the courtyard, you worked squatting on the ground, okay? And if you're complaining about your kitchen, think about that. Okay? And what did you have to do your cooking? So you have certain appliances, okay, that are a little similar to ours, but not so much. But they're important for understanding the laws of Shabbat and so many other laws. So we hear a lot about something called a kira, right? Or a kupach. Here's a kira. This is a beautiful example. This picture on the left here. This is a kira that was discovered in Masada. What's a kira? Kira is basically a stovetop, right? And today in modern Hebrew, we say kirayim. Kirayim is your stovetop. What is it? Right? Take a look at it carefully. It's basically two stones, okay, on the bottom. There's a fire in between, okay, and you put a slab on top with holes for the pots. It's a very primitive but very useful way to cook. And this was actually found completely whole in Masada, right? And you light your fire and then you can cook on your pots just like you can do today. And they even found nice pots nearby. That's a kira. You also have a single one, which seems to be more portable, called a kupach, but you also have something called a tanur. Now, modern Hebrew, a tanur is an oven, and in ancient Hebrew, a tanur is an oven as well. And a tanur is something that we find across cultures and across the time periods, from ancient Egypt to immigrants to Israel in the early 20th century, brought a tanur with them, right? This is something that is very, very common. And in fact, if you know a little about, Indian culture, what's the oven called? A tandoor. It's the same thing, right? So this is a very, very common way to bake or to cook. What you have is you have this kind of a clay dome, as you can see with this lady here, with a fire at the bottom. You might have a shelf, or you might just have a hole on the top where you reach in and you slam your pita against the wall of the oven, and then you take it off when it's cooked. And today, by the way, you can still go in certain older neighborhoods of Jerusalem, in the Old City or in the Bukharin Quarter. You can see tanurim like this. They still exist. And this is the tanur that the Mishnah is talking about when it talks about what you're allowed to put in before Shabbat to warm, right? Think about it for a second. How did you have hot food on Shabbat? You can't leave the fire burning because that's cooking. Also, it's dangerous, right? So what do? The tanur retains heat much, much longer than the kira. So that's perfect for Shabbat. You can turn off, you can put out the fire, but you can put something inside. And this is the Mishnah talks about tomnim, right? You hide the food inside. You can wrap it up and it will stay warm for a very long time. And you can even cook your cholent that way, right? So this is our tanur, our kira, different ways of cooking. And we hear about tanurim a lot now. The tanur usually was out in the courtyard. I apologize for the quality of this picture, not a great picture, hey, but the story is a great story. The tanur was usually out in the courtyard. And like we said before, shared courtyard. Everybody knows what you are cooking all the time. So we have this very distressing story, right? Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa, very righteous man, but a very poor man. And his wife naturally was embarrassed at their poverty, and she didn't want anyone to know about their poverty. So Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa, even though she had nothing to cook, she would make a fire with a lot of smoke to make it appear that she was baking, despite the fact that there was no bread in her house. She had a certain evil neighbor who said to herself, I know they have nothing, right? Everybody's a busybody in the courtyard. What is all this smoke? So she went and knocked on the door to find out what was in the oven. Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa's wife was embarrassed. She ascended to an inner room and she's hiding from this busybody. A miracle was performed for Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa's wife as her neighbor saw the oven filled with bread and the kneading basin filled with dough. wasn't there before. She said to Rabbi Hanina's wife, calling her by name, so-and-so, bring a shovel as your bread is burning. That's the comeuppance of the busybody lady, right? And Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa and his wife get the reward, but it illustrates for us how there is no privacy in the courtyard. Okay, now we were looking at a town that, poor, lower middle class, right? Average farmers, people. They're also very wealthy people. And these are pictures from the Herodian quarter in Jerusalem, from the houses of the wealthy Kohanim who lived in Jerusalem at the end of Second Temple times, and they obviously had a higher standard of living. Okay? They had more furniture, tables, which we didn't see in the other houses, chairs, beds, right? Some of the furniture made out of wood, so we don't have it anymore. Some of it made out of stone. In Second Temple times, we have, and we're going to see in a few minutes, a lot of stone vessels. So we actually have furniture from 2,000 years ago, and we can get a sense of what a room might have looked like. And this is really a formal triclinium, right? This is what the Roman word for a living room, three, reclining, right? You're reclining in the three parts of the room, 1, 2, 3. You're lying on couches. That's how they did it in the old days. That's why we recline at the Seder, because that's how wealthy people lived. And we can see some of the furniture and give a little bit of a sense. We can also see their dishes of what life was like if you were a wealthier person. Let's go outside the house and let's take a look at the street. Okay. If anybody learned Masechet Eruvin recently, right? A lot of time was spent talking about different rishuyot, different parts of town. Where are you allowed to carry? Where are you not allowed to carry? What's a main street? What's a side street? What's an alleyway? Okay, so we have certain cities that are big cities. For example, Tzipori over here on the left, Tiberias, the drawing over here on the right. We found, this is obviously a photograph of the downtown of the Cardo of Tzipori. Tiberias, we've also found this main street with the gate and the entrance to the city and the theater further up. So there are cities that had a main street. The rabbis argue over whether or not this is a Rishut Harabim, where you can never be allowed to carry, right? We know that these streets were called in the language of the rabbis astratia. Okay, why? Think of the autostrada. It's a Roman word, right? Roman stratos is the street, the lithostratos in Jerusalem. Okay, so this is the main street. It's the highway. Okay, the rabbis talk about a stratia. They talk about a platia, which is a plaza, right? The plaza that you would have downtown. You also have smaller streets that are called a mavoy, an alleyway. Sometimes an alleyway could be open on both ends, a mavoy mifulash. This is from Susia, and we found both that kind of a mavoy as well as a mavoy that's closed on three sides and open on only one end, right? It's a mavoy satum, which today is used as literally as a dead end, as a metaphor, not only as an actual dead end, but this is a dead end, right? And there are differences, there are distinctions, what you can carry, where you can carry, how you can make it permissible to carry, and we're actually finding these places. It's not just theoretical. One of the most exciting things in terms of carrying was discovered, I know carrying, it's not that exciting, but it can be exciting, right? It was discovered in the town of Gamla in the Golan. Okay, if you learned Eruvin, you know that the rabbis spend a lot of time talking about something called a lechi, right? A lechi is something that you put in the entrance to this alleyway. It's sort of a symbolic door, right? It's a post that's saying we are closing off, we are allowing you to carry. So basically you have the entrance to the alleyway or the wall of the alleyway, and then you have another post next to it. We hear about it a lot in literature, but Gamla is one of the few places where we actually found it, right? Take a look. Here's the lechi, and here alongside it is the wall. Right, so if you learned Eruvin, this is very, very exciting. If you didn't learn Eruvin, it's a little less exciting, right? But to see such a thing is really brings the Gemara to life. Okay, let's talk a little bit about clothing and jewelry. Okay, objects that are close to our hearts. Okay. And again, this is something where I really feel that for most of us, our imagination fails us. We don't really think about how people dressed in the old days. We also don't think about the fact that they had very few clothes, right? Most people had your everyday, your weekday cloak, your Shabbat cloak, if you were lucky, and that's it. And most of it was very, very drab. But if you were wealthy, you had colors, right? You had color. Color was very, very, very expensive. It is very rare that we find cloth, whether it's dyed or not, because cloth is organic and it doesn't stick around for so long. But we have found, and actually it was just in the news last week, that in Timna in the south, they found cloth that's 1,000 years older than the pictures I'm showing you here. This is cloth from the Bar Kokhba caves from 1,800 years ago. They found cloth in Timna that goes back to the time of King David, which is really, really unusual and really rare. But this cloth is from the Bar Kokhba caves, and as you can see, it's dyed a beautiful blue, right? And we know colors. We hear about colors in the rabbis. We hear about the tchelet, right? The patil tchelet, the little fringe that you need on your tzitzit, and the rabbis talk about how you make it. We know there was a dyeing industry to make purples, to make reds, to make blues, but it's very rare to find such a thing, partly because it doesn't last and partly because not a lot of people had it. You had to have a lot of money to have such a thing. Now, to find this in the Bar Kokhba caves, that's fascinating, because it tells you that the people who were fighting against the Romans and who went to hide out in these caves, remember they took their keys along with them, they were also from the elite. They were also from the wealthy, and they brought their fancy cloaks with them. It wasn't only the poor people who were revolting. We also hear a lot in Shabbat, especially, about sandals and shoes, sandalim or sandal romi, right? What sandals can you wear? What can you do if the strap on your sandal breaks on Shabbat? How are you allowed to do it? We rarely find sandals. Here we have found a Roman sandal. This one is from Masada. We found them in a few other places. And one of the things that's fascinating is the Gemara in Shabbat talks about how you are not allowed to wear such sandals on Shabbat. And the question would be why, right? It seems very strange. Why would you not be allowed to wear it? One suggestion, and we found this on Roman shoes, not on this particular one, is that the nails on the bottom spell out words, right? And when you walk, you're actually creating words in the sand. So that's a fascinating example of clothing. We also find some jewelry and some accessories. And again, in Shabbat, we hear a lot about accessories because we have a whole long discussion of what you're allowed to carry, what you're not allowed to carry, what's considered part of your clothing, what's not considered part of your clothing. So when we find such things, they're amazing, right? Let's take a look at the picture on the right. I know it looks like you could have just bought it in a jewelry store, but it was actually found in the ground. Okay, gold doesn't tarnish, so it looks as good today as it did on the day that this poor lady lost her incredibly beautiful earring. This was found in Jerusalem in excavations near the city of David in the Givati parking lot. In the layer that goes back to Second Temple times, someone came on pilgrimage to Jerusalem and lost one of her earrings, and we found it 2,000 years later. So we know about earrings and other kinds of jewelry. Something that's a little more rare, the earring is familiar to us. Doesn't look, it could be sold in any jewelry store today. And in fact, the city of David has made copies and sells them. The thing on the left is a little bit less well known. Okay, this is something that the rabbis call a tzlochit shel Platon, a perfume vial. In the old days, the world smelled a lot worse than it does today. Right? And ladies of leisure, or any ladies really, would walk around with small necklaces that had on them these vials with a little bit of perfume inside, so that if you were walking through something unpleasant, you lifted this to your nose and you smelled it. And the rabbis discussed, can you take this outside on Shabbat? Can you not take it outside on Shabbat? Right? What is the perfume? Probably something we call balsam, afar simon, which was a very, very valuable perfume in the ancient world. This perfume vial was discovered in an excavation near the Kinneret in the town called Migdal, and it's a beautiful thing to see. It hasn't yet yielded any secrets as to what the perfume smelled like, but it's nice to be able to see what the vial looked like. Okay, something that was very much a part of their world and is very little a part of our world today is the idea of purity. Okay, and when we talk about purity, we talk about going to the mikvah. We are not only talking about married women after they finish menstruating, but purity really affected all segments of society, especially in temple times, but even afterwards. Eating in purity, keeping your dishes pure, keeping everything away from anything that's impure, which is anything that's a source of death. And we hear about it in so many different places in the Mishnah and the Gemara. I'm just going to give you a few nice examples. Okay, the picture here on the right is of dishes that were discovered in these houses of the Kohanim in the Herodian quarter in Jerusalem. And as you may be able to tell, they are all made out of stone. Okay, stone vessels is a symbol of a Jewish household because stone is a very hard material to make dishes out of. It's a big pain. Why would you do that when you could make pottery, which is so easy and so cheap? Why would you make things out of stone? Well, it's a status symbol, but also stone, according to Torah law, does not become impure ever. Clay, pottery becomes impure. So if someone dies in your kitchen, your pottery dishes you can't do anything about them. You can't take them to the mikveh. You can't do anything. You have to break them. But your stone dishes, they're fine. So certainly Kohanim, but other people who worried about purity would have stone dishes, and we find them all over the place because purity, as you can see in the second source here in Shabbat, come and see how far purity has spread in Israel. Purity was the issue in Second Temple times and even afterwards. Now, I want to show you one of the dishes that was discovered here because it's my favorite one, okay? And that's these, okay? As you can see, it's a nice little bottle stopper, right? It's a cork, okay? But what's fascinating is that we have not found the jar, here's another one, that it fits, okay? We only found the stoppers, and that works because if you read the Mishnah and Torah over here, the first source, if you left an Am Haaretz, someone who's not careful about purity, in his house to guard him, if he can see those that enter and leave, only food and liquids and uncovered earthenware are unclean, but couches and seats and earthenware that have tightly fitted covers remain clean. We're worried that this Am Haaretz is going to mess up, is going to make your dishes impure. But what's safe? Anything that has a tightly fitting cover made out of a material that's not going to become impure. Stone, and that's what you have here. You have these nice bottle stoppers that are made out of stone and therefore will keep everything else, all the wine, everything else from becoming impure. Of course, we have mikvahs. Right, we have mikvahs all over the land of Israel. Today, ask any child who's traveled around in Israel, what does an ancient mikvah look like? They all know. But 75 years ago, nobody knew what an ancient mikvah looked like. And we are just starting to discover them in the last 70, 60 years, finding them all over the place. This happens to be a particularly beautiful one. It's about a 10-minute walk from my house on the Path of the Patriarchs in Gush Etzion. And as you can see, it's very elaborate. It has 2 separate entrances. But what's important is not only the entrances, but that there's a wall between them. Why would you have such a thing? This is a good question. We didn't really know. But if you look at the Mishnah in Shkalim, you have a very interesting conundrum. The Mishnah says, right, if you find dishes on the steps of the mikvah, they're hefker, you can take them home. They don't belong to anybody. Should you assume they are pure or impure? Okay, if you find them on the way down, they are impure. On the way up, they are pure, since the way down is not the same as the way up. Okay, that's an amazing statement in the Gemara in Shkalim that we didn't understand until we found this mikvah, over here on Derech HaAvot, which clearly has a way in and a way out. Okay, why would you do such a thing? Because I always draw it that way, and somebody once said to me, "Why do you draw it that way?" Because you're a righty, and I said, "Oh, yeah, probably." But it's also true that the rabbis don't like lefties, and right would be, the side that you would start with. But why would you do this? Because you don't want the people who have already been purified to jostle against the people who are still impure, and therefore they would have to go back. So you make a separation. But it's a great example of a Gemara that until we came to the land of Israel, we really didn't understand completely what it was talking about. One more great example. This is a mikveh that was discovered relatively recently in the Western Wall tunnels. As you can see, it has a very small opening. This is clearly not for a person. There's not enough space. You have this very narrow area. What would this be? We suggest that perhaps this is what we would call a mikveh kalim. This is where you would take your dishes, especially your very small items, to be purified, because look at what the Mishnah says. Regarding an impure needle on the steps of a cavern which houses a mikvah, if one was moving the waters back and forth, once a wave passes over the needle, it is pure. So what do? You put your small items on these little ledges, these little steps, and then you kind of let the water splash over it. You don't have to worry about immersing it and losing it in this large mikvah. So that's all examples of purity. Okay, Burial, of course, very important. We know different time periods. We have different styles of burial. In Second Temple times, they would allow the body to decompose, and then they would put the bones in what you see here on the left, what's called an ossuary, or in the language of Chazal, a gluskema. Okay? Later on, they stopped doing that. They didn't do any two-step burial, and instead they just put the whole body into what we call a sarcophagus. That's what you see over here on the right in Beit Sha'arim. Still later, they put the body directly into the ground. But these two stages of the ossuary, of the sarcophagus, are fascinating because you can see the decorations, what was important to people, what they wrote or drew on these boxes. This one on the left here from Second Temple times is very simple, made out of stone, very elegant. It only has one thing. It has an inscription, the same inscription on the side and on the front. What does the inscription say? It says, Simon Boneh Hechala, Simon, the builder of the temple. This is what this person wanted to be remembered for. He took part in building the temple. That's what he wanted generations to remember him for. Okay, we're going to do two last things. Okay, we'll do them quickly. Okay. Documents. Okay, documents is a fascinating thing. The Gemara is full, the Mishnah and the Gemara is full of statements about shtarot, about documents that you write about debt, documents that you write for a ketubah, right, for a marriage contract, for a get, for a divorce, all over the place. So when you find real ones, that's really a very exciting thing, and it's very rare because they're, again, organic and they're not going to last very long. But in these Bar Kokhba caves that Yigael Yadin excavated in the 60s, he found not only letters from Bar Kokhba, but he found a trove of an archive of documents from a woman, even more interesting, named Bavta, who, you know, those people who have that drawer where they save every receipt ever and every electric bill from 1970s, that's Bavta. And when she ran away in the Bar Kokhba revolt, she wrapped it all up very well. Look at how it was wrapped, and took it with her. Okay. And then they were able to open them up and to read them. And they found 35 documents. And she had a very interesting, very complicated life. So we're going to look at something from her in a minute. But just, again, I couldn't resist bringing this Mishnah up. This is about lost objects. If you found documents in a satchel or a bag or a bundle of documents, he should return them. Not something just by itself, but a bundle. You could clearly find the owner, so we really should find Bavta or her descendants. But Yigael Yadin was thrilled to find this and to open it up and to be able to read it. She had a very complicated life. She had 2 different husbands. She inherited property from her father. She wanted to give on her property to her child from her first marriage, and she had documents about all these things, and all of these are examples of documents that the Mishnah and the Gemara talk about. How can you give your property in your lifetime and yet still retain enough to live on? We have her ketubah, where it talks about how she got 100 shekel tzori, or 1 maneh, right? Usually a ketubah is 2 manehs, 200 shekel tzori, unless you're a widow or a divorcee, and this is Bavta's second marriage, right? So we have all kinds of things that back up ideas that we have in the Gemara, and this is one of the really beautiful ones. Take a look at this document. Okay, Gemara and the Mishnah talk about a get mikushar, or a shtar mikushar, a tied document. And this is in order to make sure you don't have any kind of forgery. And this is from Yigael Yadin's book. He illustrated it very nicely. Take a look at the pictures on the right here. I write my document, okay? I write my document. I write everything I need to write in my document. And on the top, I have another short version of the same thing. Then what do? I roll it up and I sew it shut. And then on the back of the document, I write the people's names so that it's doubly unforgeable, right? What I can do is I can unroll it and read what's inside, but I don't have to do that. I can keep that safe and just read what's outside, see the signatures on the back, but I'm still safeguarding the authentic signatures, which are in the tied part, okay? And this is what we found in Bavta's archive. We found exactly this kind of a tied document, exactly as the Gemara describes it and writes about it. Okay, one final thing. We have a lot of discussion about medicine in the Gemara. We have a lot of doctors, probably the most famous one is Shmuel. We have a lot of good advice, which helped Jews in the Middle Ages, hygiene, washing your hands. We have a lot of not such good advice, or advice that we wouldn't take today, bloodletting and, eating certain foods to balance your humors. A lot of this comes from the famous Roman physician Galen, and this theory of the different humors that you have, the hot, the dry, the cold, the wet. You need to, different foods can heat you up or cool you down. And a lot of what the Gemara is talking about when it talks about what you're supposed to eat, when, and why is based on these ideas and on this theory. So take it with a grain of salt. Today with all kinds of alternative medicine, who knows? And I'll just finish up with the final thing, which is some names, right? It's always nice to find familiar names out in the real world that we have in the Gemara. So we have a famous teacher whose name is Elazar HaKapar. Kapar is someone who grows caper bushes and pickles capers for a living. And in the Golan, we have found a lintel that has his name on it. Here is Elazar HaKapar, and in the middle it says Zeu Beit Midrasho Shel Rebbe Elazar HaKapar. So here he is. He's in the Gemara. He lived in the town of Lod, but at some point he moved up to the Golan, and he has his Beit Midrash there. A few years ago in Tzipori, not in the ancient site of Tzipori, but in the modern town of Tzipori, there's a guy there named Mitch Pilser who has B&Bs, and he decided he wanted to expand. And in the course of his expanding, he uncovered a burial cave with a beautiful stone door. Okay? And the stone door has on it an inscription. I apologize, it's hard to read, but it says, it's Zehu Kivro Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi HaKapar. This is the grave of Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, also called HaKapar. Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, one of the most important of the Amoraim, a master of Midrash. We hear about him all over the place in the Gemara, and suddenly his grave just popped out of the ground, and that happens very often, and there are always more and more surprises in archaeology, and so much more to talk about in this topic. But I'm going to finish. I'm going to take a look and see if there are questions, and don't see questions here, but if people have questions, you can please unmute yourself and ask them, or put them in the chat, whatever is easy.
I have a question.
Yes.
Yes, on the sukkah on the camel's back, what would that be used for? For a traveling merchant or what?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? The Mishnah in Sukkah lists all kinds of sukkot that are forbidden and permitted, right? You can't have a sukkah that's too short. You can't have a sukkah that's too tall. Why would you build a sukkah on the back of the camel? Exactly, because you're traveling, right? You also have a sukkah on a boat. Right, you have all different kinds of situations. We think, we're such world travelers. They were travelers as well, right? And they also needed to solve those problems. Do we know the kinds of things they made for Shabbos day, like the food that they made? Oh, food in the Gemara is a whole other story. And in fact, I think there's actually somebody who wrote a cookbook about it. Do they have the same kind of chamin, right? Some kind of dish that they kept warm? That's a great question. I don't know if we know what exactly they ate, right? We definitely know that they keep their food warm, certainly on Friday night, but I don't have a cookbook for you. I wish I did. Right? In the first slide, what are the images of the coin? They look agricultural. They are agricultural. They are not people. They are sheaves of wheat. I don't remember what else. Other questions people have?
I have a question. Do Roman sources shed any light on, I obviously be somewhat indirect, but shed light on the everyday lives of the Jews during this period?
Look, Romans assume that Jews are very strange. Jews are very funny. Okay, in Roman comedies on the stage, the theater, the butt of the jokes is Jews, because Jews are crazy, right? Jews don't work once a week. Jews worship this invisible God, right? So we hear about ourselves in the Roman eyes, but usually in a very mocking way, right? As well as realize that the Romans don't, and this is a little bit of a problem with Josephus, who writes for a Roman audience, they don't have a sense of halakha. They don't understand what that means, right? Living life by a certain legal system. So the customs or the laws of the Jews are kind of mysterious to them. They don't really get what's going on. Besides the fact that I think we as Jews assume that everybody's talking about us when they're not really. We're not as important to the Romans as we think we are. Okay, anyone else or yes?
Is there one more question in the chat?
In the chat, sorry, I didn't see another question in the chat. No.
In the first slide, what are the images on the coin?
Oh, yeah, I said that. I said that.
Okay.
That's it is agricultural. It's not people. It's sheaves of wheat and something else. I have to look back at it and see.
This is Diane with a question. I got confused when you were showing the layouts of houses and courtyards. You started with a house that had some ovens in some rooms, and then you moved to the photograph of the 19th century building. So what kind of location or setting would that first house that had the cutaway?
Okay, so this is in the north, in the Golan. There's a town called Katzrin. And what they did, they discovered the ancient village there, but it wasn't very easy to see what a house looked like. So what they did is they built a model house, basically, to give you an idea of all these different parts of the courtyard, of the upper chambers, of all these different things. So the drawing was a drawing of this physical building that they created in Katzrin. Is that what you were asking?
So that would be a house in a
village, in a town, in a Jewish town.
Okay, thank you.
Not one that was found, but one that was, imagined from what we know so far. Okay.
That's good. Thank you.
Where was the livestock house? In the courtyard, right? And on really cold nights in the house. Okay, kept everybody warm. What's the name of the person? Oh, Mitch Pilser in Tzipori. Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much, Shulie. This certainly was a treat and painted a beautiful picture that fleshes out our learning in Mishnah and Gemara. And I'm sure we're all much wiser for it. For anybody who didn't have a chance to absorb everything that Shulie gave us today, the recordings will be available during the week. And I also want to let everybody know that next Sunday, February 7th, the next class in our series of speakers from Israel will be Rabbanit Gila Rosen, next Sunday, February 7th at 10 a.m. Thank you all very much for coming, and thank you again, Shulie.
Thank you, Shulie.
Thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure.
Yep.
Thank you.